The air inside the private gymnasium that afternoon was stagnant and heavy, thick with the sharp, medicinal scent of liniment and the rhythmic, metallic thud of a heavy bag being worked in a far corner. It was a space defined by a lack of ornament, bare concrete walls, floor mats stained by years of salt and effort, and the low, industrial hum of a floor fan that did little more than move the sweltering heat from one shadow to another. There were no spectators here, save for a few cornermen and close associates whose figures were silhouettes against the grimy brickwork. In the center of this world stood two men who represented the absolute opposite ends of the combat spectrum. Larry Holmes, known to the boxing world as the Easton Assassin, was a massive physical presence, a man whose body was a refined engine of heavyweight destruction. Standing well over 6 feet and weighing a solid 220 pounds, Holmes possessed a reach that seemed to command the very air around him. He moved with the practiced, heavy grace of a professional prize fighter, his feet flat and sure, his hands constantly twitching with the muscle memory of a million jabs. Opposite him was Bruce Lee, a man who appeared almost lean to the point of fragility when placed in the shadow of a heavyweight champion. He stood at 5'7", his frame stripped of all unnecessary mass, leaving only cords of functional muscle that shifted visibly beneath his skin with every breath. Bruce did not stand like a boxer, his stance was narrow, his weight distributed onto the balls of his feet, appearing less like a fighter and more like a coiled spring held under immense tension. The atmosphere between them was not one of open hostility, but rather a professional curiosity that had reached its breaking point. Holmes, accustomed to the rigid hierarchies of the boxing ring where size and reach were the ultimate arbiters of truth, looked at Lee with a mixture of respect for his fame and skepticism of his actual utility in a real exchange. He didn't see a threat in the smaller man's frame, he saw a technician whose theories had yet to be tested against the raw, blunt force of a world-class jab. Larry Holmes, leaning against the ropes while a trainer tightened the laces on his gloves, looked across at Lee and spoke of the reality of the 32nd round. He noted that in his world, a man who couldn't take a hit didn't belong in the ring. He told Bruce that speed was a fine thing for a demonstration, but that under the pressure of a heavyweight attack, speed often turned into panic. He laid down the challenge with a casual shrug: if Lee could remain functional and upright for just 30 seconds against a focused attack, Holmes would concede to his status as a master. Bruce Lee listened in silence, his expression unreadable, his eyes fixed not on Holmes' face, but on the center of his chest, observing the rise and fall of the champion's breath. He accepted with a short, sharp nod, stepping into the center of the floor without the need for gloves or a bell. As the trainer raised his hand to signal the start, the physical reality of the two men became the only thing that mattered. The hand dropped, and the clock began its invisible march. The first second was a study in stillness. Larry Holmes did not rush, he moved with the calculated predatory grace of a veteran, stepping forward with his lead foot, his left hand already pulsing with the intent of the jab. He was measuring the distance, using his 60-inch reach to probe the air. He felt confident. Bruce Lee was within his hitting zone, yet the smaller man wasn't moving. Bruce remained in a semi-relaxed stance, his lead hand low, his body slightly bladed. To a boxer, this looked like an invitation to a knockout. In the second, Holmes launched the jab. It was a masterpiece of mechanics, starting from the ball of his rear foot, traveling through his rotating hip, and snapping out like a whip. But as the glove approached the space where Lee's face had been a millisecond before, the dragon moved. It wasn't a frantic dodge, it was a displacement of 3 inches. Bruce tilted his head just enough for the leather of the glove to graze the air beside his ear. He didn't back away. As Holmes' arm reached full extension, Bruce used that moment of commitment to step into the champion's personal space. By the 3rd second, Larry Holmes realized he had missed, but more importantly, he realized his opponent was now inside the dead zone of his reach. He tried to pull his arm back to reset his guard, but Bruce's hand was already there. This was the bridging phase. Bruce's lead hand touched Holmes' forearm with a light, sticky pressure. This tactile feedback told Bruce exactly where Holmes' balance was shifting before the champion even knew it himself. In the 4th second, Holmes tried to compensate with a right cross, shifting his weight to his back leg to throw a blow that carried enough kinetic energy to crack ribs. But Bruce didn't wait. He utilized the concept of interception. As Holmes' shoulder began to roll, Bruce stepped even deeper, his lead foot sliding between Holmes' legs. This disrupted the champion's base. Holmes felt his weight being tilted backward. His right hand swung through the air, missing its target completely because his center of gravity had been compromised. For the first time in his professional life, the 220-pound giant felt light, and not in a way that offered him any advantage. The 5th second felt like a minute. The onlookers saw the heavyweight champion of the world stumbling, trying to regain his footing while his arms flailed slightly. He sought to grab Lee, to clinch and use his mass to smother him. In boxing, the clinch is a reset button, but Bruce Lee was like water. Every time Holmes tried to wrap his arms around him, Bruce vanished, using short, vibrating movements of his shoulders to slip through the grasp. By the 6th second, the frustration on Holmes' face was palpable. The effort of missing while fighting for balance was draining his nervous system. He lunged forward one last time, a desperate attempt to bulldoze Lee against the wall, putting everything into a forward charge with his head down and arms wide. He was no longer boxing, he was merely reacting to a ghost. In the 7th second, the dragon decided the exchange was over. As Holmes charged, Bruce didn't move out of the way. He stepped directly into the path of the giant. He dropped his weight, bending his knees and locking his rear foot into the floorboards like a spike. He was creating a solid, unyielding structure. His lead right hand, which had been dancing near Holmes' chest, suddenly went still. It was positioned exactly over the champion's solar plexus, just an inch away from the fabric of his sweat-drenched shirt. The 8th second was the moment of the strike. There was no wind-up. Starting from Lee's rear heel, a wave of force traveled up his leg, twisted through his torso with the speed of a snapping wire, and exploded through his knuckles. It was the 1-inch punch applied with total body synchronization. The sound was a sharp, dry crack that echoed off the concrete walls. The impact didn't just push Holmes, it vibrated through his entire skeletal structure, bypassing his muscular defense and targeting the nerve centers behind the diaphragm. The 9th second was the aftermath of physics. Larry Holmes was physically lifted off the floor. His 220 pounds were momentarily suspended in the air as the kinetic energy hit his internal organs. He was thrown backward as if struck by a pneumatic ram, hitting the heavy bags behind him with a sound that shook the gym's windows. He slid down the leather and landed on the mat, his diaphragm paralyzed, his face turning an alarming shade of purple as his body struggled to draw air. The trainer's stopwatch read exactly 9 seconds. The gym was so silent you could hear the water dripping in the corner. Bruce Lee stood exactly where he had delivered the strike, his hands having returned to a relaxed guard. He wasn't panting. He wasn't sweating. He waited until Holmes managed a ragged, whistling breath, then stepped forward to offer his hand. Holmes took the hand, his grip trembling. With help, he managed to sit up, then eventually stand, leaning heavily against the ropes. He didn't speak for a long time, looking at Bruce with a gaze stripped of all ego. He admitted he hadn't even seen the move. One moment he was attacking, the next he was on the floor. Bruce simply adjusted his shirt and offered a respectful smile, noting that Holmes had been fighting the man he saw, rather than the force being generated. In a fight, the eyes see size, but the body feels intent. Holmes had been waiting for a 30-second round, while Bruce had only been interested in the first second. The lesson was written in the bruises on Holmes' chest and the sudden, profound respect in his eyes. Strength is an engine, but mastery is the spark that makes the size of the engine irrelevant. As Bruce Lee walked out into the heat, the heavy bags continued to swing, a slow, rhythmic reminder of the power that had just passed through the room. The preparation for this moment had been as intense as the fight itself. In the minutes leading up to the challenge, the other fighters in the gym had stopped their own work to watch the two icons. You could smell the collective anticipation, a mix of old sweat, floor wax, and the metallic tang of the nearby shipyards. Holmes had spent those minutes in a state of professional ritual, massive legs spread wide as his hands were wrapped, the sound of the gauze tearing like percussion in the silence. He had felt a sense of heavy inevitability, believing that physics was on his side. Bruce Lee, by contrast, had spent the time in active meditation, performing shadow movements so small they were almost invisible. He was checking the friction of the floor and calibrating his internal clock. He looked at Holmes not as a man, but as a series of levers. He knew he couldn't trade punches, he had to operate in the interstices, the tiny gaps in time that a boxer usually ignores. The visual contrast when they finally met was jarring, mountain against reed. The trainer holding the watch felt his palms sweating, knowing that if Holmes landed a clean shot, the consequences could be severe. But the gravity of the moment was too strong to stop. When the first 3 seconds passed in a circular center, Holmes had used feints to draw a reaction, but Bruce remained still, waiting for the reality of the punch rather than the threat. By the 5th second, when Bruce wrapped Holmes' arm against his own chest, the champion was already bewildered by a speed he couldn't track. By the 9th second, the result was absolute. Larry Holmes would go on to have one of the greatest careers in boxing history, defending his title 20 times, but he would never forget the afternoon he learned that combat is not a game of sizes, but a game of truths. The story of the 9 seconds was a demonstration of a higher state of being, the moment the dragon met the assassin and proved that while an assassin can kill, a dragon can redefine the nature of reality. As the door closed behind Bruce Lee, the silence of the 9-second miracle remained, a ghost in the ring that no heavyweight would ever be able to ignore. This confrontation was more than a physical clash, it was a psychological dismantling. Holmes had lived his entire life within the boundaries of a ring where the largest man with the best jab usually dictated the terms of existence. To him, Bruce Lee was a puzzle, but one that could surely be solved with enough pressure. Yet, as the seconds ticked by, Holmes found that the pressure was being turned back on him in ways he didn't understand. Every time he committed his weight, he felt it being redirected, as if the floor beneath him had become slanted. By the time the 8th second arrived, Holmes wasn't just losing a fight, he was losing his understanding of how combat worked. When the strike landed, it wasn't just his breath that was taken away, but his certainty. The silence that followed was not just the absence of noise, but the presence of a new kind of knowledge. The witnesses stayed frozen for long after Bruce had left. They looked at the heavy bags, still swaying from the impact of a 220-pound man being launched into them. They looked at the stopwatch. They looked at the spot where the smaller man had stood. There was a sense that the room had been a laboratory for a moment, and a fundamental law of the universe had been rewritten. The trainers, men who had seen thousands of rounds of boxing, didn't talk about the punch as a hook or a cross. They talked about it as a release. It was as if Bruce Lee had simply opened a valve and let a tidal wave through. Larry Holmes, eventually recovering his breath, would later speak of Bruce not as a movie star, but as a force. He realized that the 30-second challenge was a gift. If Bruce had truly wanted to destroy him, 9 seconds would have been 6 seconds too many. In the years that followed, the story of those 9 seconds began to travel through the underground circuits of the fighting world, passing from one gym to another like a whispered secret that shouldn't exist. It was told in the damp basements of Brooklyn and the high-end dojos of Tokyo, and with each telling, the details were poked and prodded by skeptics who couldn't reconcile the physics of the encounter. They argued that a man of Larry Holmes' stature simply could not be moved by a strike with no wind-up. They insisted that the Easton assassin must have tripped, or that the whole thing was a staged demonstration for the sake of Lee's growing celebrity. But for the men who sat on those wooden benches that afternoon, the truth remained as solid and unyielding as the concrete floor beneath their feet. They didn't need to debate the why, because they had felt the how. They had seen the heavy bags, dense cylinders of packed sand and leather, nearly snap their chains from the secondary impact of Holmes' body. They had seen the stopwatch, its digital display frozen at a number that defied the standard duration of a combat engagement. For Larry Holmes, the encounter didn't end when he finally caught his breath or when the purple hue faded from his face. He walked away from that gym with a bruise on his chest that lasted for weeks, a dark, circular mark that served as a physical map of where the dragon's energy had entered his body. But more than the physical mark, he carried a profound expansion of his soul. He had spent his life believing that a fight was a contest of wills decided by who could endure the most pain and who could leverage the most weight. That day, he learned that size is a factor only when the mechanics of the two combatants are equal. He realized that against a man whose every cell moved in total, synchronized harmony, his own 220 pounds had actually become a liability. His mass gave Bruce a larger target to hit, and his momentum gave Bruce more energy to redirect. In those 9 seconds, the very attributes that had made Holmes a champion, his height, his reach, his heavy bones, were turned into the tools of his own collapse. He had seen the dragon strike, and in that brief window of time, he had seen the absolute limit of what a human being could achieve when they stopped fighting against the world and started moving with it. The gymnasium eventually returned to its normal rhythm, but it was a rhythm that felt forever altered. The sound of the speed bags, the rapid-fire tap-tap-tap, no longer seemed like the pinnacle of speed. The heavy thud of boxers hitting the bags no longer sounded like the ultimate expression of power. For those who had witnessed the 9-second miracle, the air in that space always felt a little thinner, a little more electric, as if the memory of the strike was still vibrating within the molecules of the concrete walls. Trainers who had once shouted at their pupils to hit harder, or bulk up, found themselves falling silent, watching the way their fighters moved their hips and feet, looking for that elusive synchronization they had seen in the smaller man. The gym became a place of quiet observation, a laboratory where the old rules of the ring were constantly being weighed against the new reality they had seen. As Larry Holmes climbed the ranks of the professional boxing world, eventually claiming the heavyweight title and defending it against the most legendary names in the sport, he never spoke of the encounter in interviews. It wasn't out of shame or a desire to protect his reputation, it was because the experience was too raw, too functional to be reduced to a movie star story. When he faced monsters like Ernie Shavers or took the best shots from Ken Norton, he would sometimes feel a phantom ache in his solar plexus, a reminder of the time he had been hit not by a glove, but by a force that felt like it came from the earth itself. He knew that the men he was fighting in the ring were giants, but he also knew that he had already faced the most dangerous man on the planet. He knew that the real heavyweight wasn't the one who could move the most weight, but the one who could move himself with the most perfect intent. The story persisted because it tapped into a fundamental human truth that transcends sport. It became a narrative of the underdog, but one stripped of the usual sentimental fluff. It was a cold, physical demonstration that mastery is the only true equalizer. People wanted to see the knockout, they wanted to see the blood and the drama, but the real lesson was found in the silence of the aftermath. It was the realization that the most dangerous person in any room isn't the one who wants to fight, and it isn't the one with the loudest reputation or the biggest muscles. It is the person who has reached a state of such complete internal alignment that a fight becomes unnecessary, the person who can end a 30-second challenge in 9 seconds because they are not fighting the opponent, but the very concept of resistance itself.